You can also have people share in religion. And whenever people share certain traits and they resemble one another, they naturally care for one another. They naturally see themselves as part of one group. Now, throughout human history, there is a psychological phenomenon such that different groups compete with one another for power and resources. In fact, even this is something that we also find among chimpanzees. Each group of chimpanzees has its territory, and the male chimpanzees from a particular group will patrol the boundaries of that territory, and they will fight with other chimpanzee groups in order to enlarge their territory. So this is why we would even say in human society today, every country, even if you don't necessarily want to fight wars, every country has to have a military to protect itself, because it is assumed that human beings are such that they will expand at the expense of others. And every country, every people sees itself as obliged to help one another and to ensure that it has as much resources and ensure that it has resources and power to protect one another. So you have this doctrine in Islam as well. You have this notion that Muslims are one group, they are one ummah, they are one nation, they're one bangsa that is united not by blood, not by culture, but by a set of beliefs and rituals. And they should help defend one another. And some of the rules of, for instance, such as jihad, pertain to that. So that would be another example of kind of a universal intuition. However, fifth universal moral intuition is care for human beings or animals generally. So yes, you have a special amount of care that you give to your family. You have a special amount of care that you give to the group that you're part of, to your nation. At the same time, you also care for humans and animals generally, basically for every living thing. And you find that in Islam. You say that, for instance, even if Muslims are fighting a war with another group, they still have to show them a certain level of care. They say, if you convert, you are no longer our enemy. You are now our friend. Many societies don't do that, actually. If you fight a war, you're not allowed to kill women and children or the elderly. If you fight a war, you're not allowed to mutilate people. And ideally, and you also have other situations where, generally speaking, kindness to non-Muslims is something which is encouraged, and even kindness to animals. So, for instance, if you slaughter an animal, you can't torture the animal. You can't beat up the animal. You have to slaughter it in a halal way, which means, sharpening the knife away from it's such that the animal can't see that, and then quickly slitting its neck such that it doesn't suffer. And in Islam, you don't have the idea, for instance, hunting animals for fun. You can hunt them for food, but you shouldn't hunt them for no reason. You shouldn't use them for target practice. You shouldn't beat an animal on its face. So these are all kind of Islamic legal teachings which reflect Islam does not only say that there's a level of care that you owe to human beings who aren't Muslim, but even there's a level of care that you owe to animals. Okay. Sixth moral intuition that we can talk about is positive reciprocity. So positive reciprocity is basically, if someone does something good to you, if someone gives you a benefit, you are obliged to give them a benefit as well and thank them. So this in Arabic is usually referred to as shukr al-mun'am. For instance, in Islam, there's the idea that, neighbors should help one another. So one neighbor should help the other, and the other neighbor should respond back. And in fact, the notion of positive reciprocity is actually very central to Islamic worship. The idea is that God gives us all kinds of benefits. God gives us all kinds of ni'am, and we thank and love him for that. And we reciprocate by doing his will. Another notion, a seventh moral intuition, is negative reciprocity. So positive reciprocity means that if someone does something good for you, you are morally obligated to do something equally good for them. Negative reciprocity is that if someone harms you, you are morally entitled to impose an equivalent harm on them. So, for instance, if someone knocks out your tooth, you are entitled to knock out their tooth as well. So this notion of a harm entitles the sufferer to impose an equal harm. This is an element of various parts of the Sharia, but perhaps the most obvious is in the rule of qisas. So, for instance, in the rule of qisas, if someone knocks out your eye, if someone kills you, you can forgive it. You can accept monetary compensation, but you're also entitled to impose a similar harm on them. An eighth moral intuition concerns authority or hierarchy. So basically, people within every group, there are people who have extra amounts of power and high status and leadership roles. And they are responsible for taking care of others. And the idea is that you have a moral obligation to respect those in authority. So one example would be that you're not just entitled to launch a rebellion against your ruler. That is not something you're entitled to do. But this also doesn't only apply, the notion of respect, that people have a moral obligation to respect authorities, does not only pertain to the government level, but for instance, it also relates to families. So parents have authority over children. And children should not disrespect their parents. You should not say oof to your parents. You need to treat them in a respectful way. You need to obey them. Ninth moral intuition that is universal is fairness, but one of the things about fairness is it appears the data that we have indicates that that human beings naturally see fairness in one of three ways. So fairness means that, so one interpretation of fairness is if there is a resource, every individual gets an exactly identical share. So for instance, if there is a well and there are 3 people, everyone is entitled to a third of the water. A second way of interpreting fairness is fairness based on need. So for instance, if you have a well and if you have 3 people, but one of them is especially thirsty, one of them maybe needs to drink more water in order to survive, because they need more water, you give them more water. A third interpretation of fairness is that of merit. So merit means that a person's share is based on how much work they've put in. So imagine 3 people dug a well together, but one person spent twice as much time digging this well. Then that person is entitled to a greater share of the water, so more than 1/3 of the water. And in all societies, you find these 3 interpretations of fairness, although they are emphasized to a greater extent in different societies. So the idea that all people are entitled to a level of equality, you can find this in Islamic law, that for instance, all Muslims have certain basic rights that are shared. Everyone has a right to have their property protected. Everyone has a right to have their life protected, and everyone will be subject to equivalent punishments, generally speaking. You have a situation where you don't have a situation where some people don't have their lives protected, where some people are allowed to engage in theft and not others, because this would be considered unfair. Of course, you do have these various interpretations of fairness, which can justify different amounts of different distributions of good based on need or based on merit. So, for instance, most people a child, for instance, is entitled to extra food from their relatives, even if the child doesn't work, because the child needs it. A woman is entitled to financial support because she needs that more than her husband. So for instance, maybe if a woman is pregnant, or maybe if she is caring for young children, she's breastfeeding, it's more difficult for her to work. So because she needs additional financial support, that means that her male family members or her husband is obliged to give her nafaqah. That's not a right that a man has. But in that case, this is not seen as unfair because there's a different level of need for both individuals. Then a 10th universal moral intuition is individual liberty. And in fact, this is an interesting one. You can test it with very young children. If you go ahead and you ask children to look at puppet shows, or if you ask them to look at cartoons, they believe that it is good to help people achieve their goals, and it is bad to prevent them from achieving their goals. So for instance, if they see cartoons on a screen and they see one, for instance, a person reaching for, imagine that there is a box and that box contains a ball, and they see a cartoon of someone reaching for the ball that is in the box, and then they see another character slam the box shut and prevent that character from getting the ball. They say that person, the children will say, the character who slammed the box shut and who prevented the person from getting the ball is evil, is bad, because they blocked the other person from realizing their goal. So all human beings believe that, all things being equal, it is good to help people achieve their goals, and it's bad to block people from achieving their goals without a reason. And in fact, this is important in Islamic law. You, without a doubt, have many prohibitions in Islamic law, but there are also many things that are halal in Islamic law. There is haram and there is halal, and halal things are things that people should be entitled to do. They are things that shouldn't be prohibited. And even if you prohibit something, there's this idea in Islamic law that you do not prohibit without a reason. If you prohibit it, it is in order to realize some benefit. So jalb al-masalih or daf' al-mafasid. You don't just simply prohibit things for no reason, because if there is no reason to block someone's individual liberty, you should not block their individual liberty. You should not restrict their behavior. The final intuition that I would like to mention is quite complex, but it's arguably the most interesting one. It is a universal moral intuition known as disgust. So human beings have this intuition that they should avoid disgusting things. And they have a very specific idea. There are very specific things that are regarded by human beings as disgusting. So one of these things, so there's this idea that everyone should be clean, that everyone should care about purity or tahara, and that they should avoid things which are disgusting, which are najis, which are qadir. So how do human beings across society see, what do they consider to be disgusting? And there are different classes of things that human beings across the world consider disgusting. One is bodily secretions. So that means vomit, pus, semen, feces, and urine. Another thing that all human beings find disgusting is certain sexual behaviors like incest, promiscuity, bestiality. Another thing that people find disgusting across societies is meats that they did not eat, meat and animal products that they did not eat when they were children. So generally speaking, people don't think plants are disgusting. Generally speaking, people don't think minerals like rocks, certain types of rocks or sand are disgusting. But they find meat and animal products to be disgusting unless they have consumed it, eating those animal products to be disgusting unless they have consumed it in their childhood. So for instance, I would imagine that many people in Indonesia, or at least this is true of people in America, Americans don't have any issue eating chicken or cows because they've had these things when they are children. However, they have an issue eating things like crocodiles, eating things like bats. This became a big issue with the coronavirus. For instance, the idea that it came from people eating bat soup. So one might say, well, what is the explanation for these things that people consider disgusting? And they're all tied to pathogen transmission. So they're all things that tend to make you sick. So one really easy way to spread diseases is through bodily secretions. So for instance, touching other people's blood, touching other people's pus or semen, that is a very easy way to get diseases. And people who didn't think those things were disgusting would have very much easily been infected by diseases. Aside from bodily secretions, another thing which very easily spreads diseases is sexual behavior, certain types of sexual behavior. So for instance, if you engage in incest, your children are likely going to have genetic defect diseases. If you engage in promiscuity, for instance, having sex with lots of different partners, you are likely to catch a disease. And similarly, if you eat foods, so generally speaking, every human community, every human group has developed immunity to the types of foods that it is used to eating, but they have not developed immunity to types of foods that they did not eat when they were children. So human beings also, and if you don't have immunity to eating a particular type of meat, it's very easy for you to get sick. So this is another reason why people they don't like unfamiliar meats. So on the one hand, there is disgust. People want to avoid disgusting things. And when you avoid disgusting things, it means you are maintaining purity. And maintaining purity is a very important part of the Islamic religion. Tahara is a very important part of the Islamic religion. So for instance, you have to wash yourself with water through, let's say, ablution, wudu. And after you go to the bathroom, you have to, for instance, remove the remnants of feces. You have to remove the remnants of urine. Also, you are not allowed to engage in sexual behaviors like promiscuity, like bestiality, like incest. These are all things which are haram in Islamic law. And also in terms of the meats that you're able to eat, they are very limited in number. So many animals, whether we're talking about a pig, whether we're talking about a dog, these type of animals are animals that should be avoided. So this is so purity in Islamic law in the same way, and in Hindu law and Jewish law, purity is an important aspect of traditional Islamic morality, and it has a universal psychological foundation. So let me just say make a few more remarks to sum things up. Human morality has arguably, it's based on universal moral intuitions. These universal moral intuitions are many in number. So morality is a complex thing. Different societies mold these intuitions in different ways. So for instance, one can believe that, for instance, that one should take care of one's family, and one way of taking care of one's family is to leave them wealth after you die. But in terms of what the specific inheritance rules are, they vary from society to society. One can believe that property rights should be respected, but in terms of how you punish a thief, whether it is corporal punishment, like amputation of the hand, whether it is imprisonment, whether it is a fine, those are going to vary from society to society and from legal system to legal system. So simply claiming that there are universal moral intuitions is not to say that every legal or moral system is the same. No. Of course, legal and moral systems are very different. So they have so when we talk about any moral system like the Sharia, it has deep fundamental similarities with other moral and legal systems. However, it is also unique and different in the sense that it has a particular way of it is given specific laws. So there are many ways to take care of your family, but Islamic law has a specific set of inheritance rules to take care of your family after you die. There are many ways of ensuring respect for property rights, but Islam has a specific set of criminal punishments. So I don't want to deny, on the one hand, I'd like to I think cognitive science helps us appreciate how Islamic law is similar to other moral and legal systems. At the same time, it is different in other ways. And I think that in the future, studies on Islamic law, which apply a cognitive science paradigm, are going to be able to explore some of these similarities and some of these differences. Okay, so that is what I had to say, and I will conclude with that.
Thank you very much, Professor Dr. Aria Nakissa. Please, ladies and gentlemen, please give a big applause to Professor Aria Nakissa. Right. Okay. This is highly important and excellent presentations. Yeah. And now we step to the question and answer session. And I saw here in question and answer column, there are about 3 to 7 questions. So I will read one by one, Aria.
Okay.
And first from Pa Ahmad Bukhari Muslim PhD, yeah, who obtained his PhD in education at Monash University, and he is now director of international office at University Pendidikan Indonesia in Bandung. Yeah. Thank you for your inspiring talk, Dr. Aria Nakissa. I have some questions. Maybe one. How universal is religious morality? For instance, is Islamic morality acceptable in non-Muslim world? Is religious morality part of culture, or vice versa? Culture is determined by religion. So in regard to this question, Nakissa, I think perhaps I need to add with several questions such as whether or not morality develop naturally or by learning. Whether or not morality.
Okay, so I can try and the best way for me to answer these questions is if I try and do them one at a time, because otherwise I might forget what I have been asked.
Good.
So the general view is that not only, so if we're talking about cognitive science research, people believe that there aren't only moral intuitions, there are also universal religious intuitions. For instance, that the soul continues to exist after death, that there is some kind of spirit, that there are spirits or a creator God that has produced the world, that if you do something bad, you're going to somehow be punished for it. If you do something good, you're going to somehow be rewarded for it. The general view among cognitive science researchers is that moral intuitions and religious intuitions are separate. So you can have a system, for instance, a secular society, and they will have a set of moral intuitions, and they are not mixed with the religious intuitions. But you can have other societies, it's also very common to mix together religious intuitions and moral intuitions. And this is what generally happens in the world's major religious traditions, like Islam, Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism. Also, if one talks about what's the relationship between culture and biology, culture and biology both play a very important role. So we would say that, for instance, the fact that in every single society in the world, there is property rights, that people have some notion of property that has a biological or psychological basis. However, the rules for protecting property in terms of, for instance, punishment of thieves, that really varies from society to society and is specific to individual cultures. So whenever we're trying to understand any moral system, we have to give a lot of attention to the impact of culture, and also biology. I will say this, I would just to make one additional point that I didn't get into. There is evidence that certain forms of technology, that certain forms of thought are capable of leading to the repression of moral intuitions. And when you repress people's moral intuitions, they no longer believe necessarily that things are disgusting or that you should take care of your kin. They will start thinking in strictly utilitarian terms. So generally speaking, if you train people from the time that they are children in schools and you say, you should doubt, whatever you believe in, you should doubt it. Whatever you believe in, you need evidence for. Because our intuitions don't have external evidence. They just appear to be obvious to us, but we can't prove them. There's no additional proof that we can necessarily give for them. They just seem to be the case. So if you teach people a specific type of thought known as analytic thought, that leads to the weakening of people's moral intuitions. And it's been argued that this is one characteristic of liberal thought. Liberal thought is, of course, built on human moral intuitions to some extent, but it also represses or it also weakens them in a variety of ways. So I hope that helps to some extent.
Thank you, Pak Aria. So it is to some extent that moral intuition is naturally developed, while religious intuition is to some extent socially created. Yeah, I think.
Well, religious intuition also has a strong biological and psychological basis, but it is also shaped. So, for instance, you can have many societies that believe in an immortal soul. This is a fundamental moral intuition. Children automatically have this belief regardless of how they're taught, or many will have a tendency to believe in this. But some societies believe that this immortal soul, some religious traditions believe this immortal soul circulates through different bodies in a cycle of reincarnation. This is what you find in Hinduism. This is what you find in Buddhism. Other religious traditions believe, no, the immortal soul actually doesn't circulate in a cycle of reincarnation. In fact, there's some kind of final judgment in heaven or hell. So that's more the Abrahamic traditions of Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and also Zoroastrianism.
Okay. Thank you for Aria. It's very, very clear. The next question would be from Pak Miftah Wangsa Danureja. He is a lecturer at State Institute for Islamic Studies, Metro, and also at University of Pelita Bangsa in Bekasi. He has 3 questions, I think one of which is asking you your PowerPoint. And we have 219 participants. Most of them ask you to provide the PowerPoint, but it is your privilege, okay? And then the next question is this: how do we combine the concept of Bloom theory with cognitive theory in Islamic teaching?
Bloom theory?
Yeah. I don't know what Pamita means with Bloom theory. Is it blooming theory or Bloom theory?
I apologize. I'm not quite sure what Bloom theory means.
Perhaps this is Indonesian English. Yeah. So Pamita, please clarify this. And then the last one from him is there any combination between Arabic and English religious education at Harvard University as an interdisciplinary program?
There are a variety. So there are programs, there are a variety of Islamic studies programs at Harvard. So for instance, there's a Center for Middle Eastern Studies that teaches Arabic and Islamic studies, and you can get a degree in Middle Eastern studies. There's also a department called Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations, where you can study Arabic and Islamic studies, although you focus more on the you focus more on the pre-modern period, whereas in Center for Middle Eastern Studies, it's more on contemporary Arab Middle Eastern societies. You can also be in a program like anthropology or history or religious studies. And if you specialize in Muslim societies, you have the opportunity to study Arabic. With respect to the PowerPoint, one thing is that I have a PowerPoint presentation, but actually I am presenting to you some material that is currently under review for articles.
I see.
I mean, I do have some articles that have already been printed. If you just go ahead and that have already been published. So for instance, I have an article that is out in Method and Study in the Theory of Religion that is about cognitive science and the study of Islam. So that doesn't deal with all the topics that I'm getting in today, but it touches on some of them. So you can just go ahead and download that directly. And I hope eventually I'm in the process of putting these things, these ideas into books and articles, and hopefully they will be published. So at that time, they will be out more generally. And then I also hope in the near future to spend some time in Indonesia and maybe teaching at Win Sharif Hidayatullah or giving some lectures at Win Sharif Hidayatullah, and hopefully making more of this material available as well.
Good. We look forward to having you here, Pak Aria. And so this is Pak Ahmad Bukhari Muslim help clarify about Bloom. Here is taxonomy Bloom theory in teaching. Is that
I'm afraid the thing is there are many fields that I'm ignorant of, and I am I have very limited knowledge of educational theory, so I apologize if.
Thank you, Pak Aria. The next question is from Pak Habibur Rahman Rizafur. What is the relationship between morality and religion? Can we call any morality religious, or can we call any religious matter moral?
The general view in cognitive science is that religion and morality are two separate things, that one can be completely irreligious, but at the same time have various moral intuitions. So for instance, one can be irreligious and still want to care for one's family or still believe that certain things are disgusting. However, there is a relation. That doesn't mean that there's no relationship between religion and morality. So one aspect of religion is that it tends to reinforce morality. So all people have moral intuitions, regardless of whether they are religious or whether they are secular. But religious people, it is often argued, have more of, or they're more likely to follow their moral intuitions. Why? Because they believe that there is some kind of supernatural punishment, or there is some supernatural being that is going to punish them if they do not act in accordance with their moral intuitions. So the idea is that morality and religion are related to one another, that religion reinforces morality. Religion strengthens morality. However, these moral intuitions are part of everyone's psychology, even if they are not particularly religious in character.
So, Aria, does it mean that someone who is religious doesn't mean that he is moral? For example, someone prays, but afterwards he cheats or she cheats, for example. Is that...
So you can have that. I mean, the general view is that doing things like prayer statistically decrease the chances you're going to cheat. There's evidence on. I'll give you an example. When we're talking, so first of all, there are different ways when we go ahead and compare countries in terms of crimes. We can't just look at the religious factor, because there are other factors that are relevant to reducing crime rates as well. So for instance, just if you have video cameras everywhere, like in China or in Western Europe, you can rely on surveillance, you can rely on advanced forensics, you can rely on also the absence of poverty. Poverty often makes people commit crimes. You can, if you remove poverty, these are other ways of decreasing crime, but religion is an interesting and can be a powerful way of reducing crime. It's especially powerful in countries that are less technologically developed. So to give you an example, homicide rates in religious countries, especially Muslim countries, are much lower than what you find in other countries with of comparable levels of economic development, like Latin America or non-Muslim parts of sub-Saharan Africa. The other thing is when people say that prayer is not, prayer is one thing and morality is another, cognitive science of religion holds that prayer is actually very much motivated by our moral intuitions. So for instance, remember the intuition of positive reciprocity. That if someone gives you something, you have a moral obligation to give something back. And so someone gives you a benefit, if they give you a blessing, you are obliged to give something back and to thank the person who has given you that benefit and to love and feel gratitude towards them. So that's a very much important part of Muslim prayer. There's this idea that God is responsible for giving you your health, your food, the food you eat, the air that you breathe. And for that reason, you owe something to God. You have an obligation to, at the very least, thank God and also do things that he asks you to do. So for instance, obey him. And also the moral intuition of respect. Earlier, I said people have this moral intuition that you should respect authorities. One universal way of showing respect is through submission gestures. So even chimpanzees crouch down, animals crouch down to show respect. And also humans across different societies, they bow or they prostrate as a way of showing respect to individuals who have more power and more status. And this is also a moral component of the prayer. So I will admit, so I fully understand that prayer is an act of ibadah. It's not one of the mu'amalat. So for that reason, we would say that prayer is not really primarily focused on the relationship between human beings. However, and it's not moral. It's not necessarily moral in the sense that it relates to morally interacting with other human beings. However, it is a way of morally interacting with God. So if one wants to act in a moral fashion towards God, one has to thank him and reciprocate due to the benefits that he has given to one. And one also has to show God respect. And if you don't reciprocate for the benefits that you've received from God, and if you don't show God respect, that would be, at least from an Islamic perspective, an immoral life. It would be immoral forms of behavior.
Thank you, Aria. So another from Liza Anggraini Amir, Ibu Liza. Assalamualaikum, Professor Nakissa. Humble and honored to meet your acquaintance, and thank you for gracing us with your presence.
They're very kind. Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
Allow me to rhetorically pose a question for you. How altruistic like taqdimul khair, how altruistic or unconditionally speaking we tend to treat these constructs of moral intuitions in our daily life to prevent spitefulness, backbiting, fitnah, ghibah, namimah, narcissistic sociopathy, and so on, etc. For instance, please kindly elaborate. Thank you. May Allah taufiq and hidayah be bestowed upon you.
I mean,
yeah.
One interesting thing about human morality, at least in terms of the data, is there are different, so there are some ways of getting people to act in a more altruistic way towards one another. And I once again, I would like to stick, at least in this presentation, it would be most fitting for me to stick to the empirical data. One example is there's a lot of interesting evidence that indicates ritual synchrony. So when people move together or sing together, they feel like they're part of one group. and they are more willing to cooperate together in a moral fashion. And this is used by different institutions. So for instance, in the military, if you want people to defend one another and protect one another and not to engage in aggression, you have them march together, or you might have them all stand up at the same time and sing Indonesia Raya together. Or alternatively, you might have everyone go to a mosque and move together and recite the Quran together. So this is one way of bonding people together in a group. Another interesting way of convincing people, in terms of empirical studies, another way of fostering altruistic behavior among people is they have to resemble one another. You need social cohesion, meaning that people have to resemble one another. So they need to share specific forms of dress. They need to share a specific language. They need to share rituals. If you have a society composed of individuals who don't share anything, they see one another as strangers, and they are less willing to engage in an altruistic fashion towards one another. This is why one thing that many nations try and do, or one thing that many religious communities try and do, is they try and develop a shared set of practices or customs that unite people together. So maybe, for instance, they say, hey, everyone's going to wear a batik, for instance, or we're all going to celebrate this holiday together, or everyone in this country is going to speak the same language, which is maybe Indonesian. Maybe if it was a country where half people spoke Indonesian and half the people spoke Dutch, you might have a situation where the groups see themselves as two separate groups and they're not as altruistic towards one another. So that would be another example of how building social cohesion through shared characteristics or through performing rituals together. These are some ways of increasing altruistic behavior between human beings.
Thank you, Pak Aria. And the last question would be from Pak Ahmad Sobianto. Yeah. To Mr. Aria, how do we integrate Islamic values with technological advances and times so that we are not considered fanatical, extremists, jihadists, and unseen? Thank you.
It's a difficult question. I'm not sure how much technology, from my own perspective, I'm not really sure that technology is a way of preventing Muslims from being called extremist or jihadi. I am, without a doubt, like many other people, of course, do not support acts of unjustified violence or whatnot. But we also have to ask questions. There are certain groups that are allowed to have identities, that are allowed to protect their traditions, and it's not seen as fanaticism. So for instance, if the French say, we want everyone to speak French, and we don't want people to veil when they go to school, we want people to dress like us. Or if the Chinese say to the Uyghurs, and they say to the Tibetans, look, these are our Han Chinese values, you have to accept them. Or if in Israel people say these are our Jewish values, we want to go ahead and preserve our tradition, a lot of people say that's not fanatic. A lot of people will say, oh, that's okay. Then the question becomes, or let's say the BJP in India, why is it okay to have a Hindu nationalist government in India? People don't consider them to be terrorists. Or if you have in the United States, a lot of people in the United States, formally or informally, are white nationalists. So they are nationalistic to preserve their American, European culture that they associate with a particular race. So one has to ask, why are certain groups considered to be fanatic or dangerous when they protect their identity and other groups are not? To me, technology is not the primary way that I would explain that. I would say that some of it has to do with politics as well. That if you are a powerful group, then you can go ahead and preserve your identity, and people have to accept it. But if you're not a powerful group and you try and preserve your identity, you don't necessarily assimilate, you don't necessarily maybe bow to certain types of pressure from others, you can be labeled an extremist or a terrorist. Not sure that this is necessarily done in an objective fashion.
Thank you very much, Pak Aria, Nakissa. So let me conclude and learn something from this highly advantageous, magnificent presentation by Pak Nakissa, Pak Aria. So in advance, I was asking myself whether morality is developed naturally or by learning, whether it is fixed or changeable over time. What is the connection between cognitive science to the Sharia? And I learned that norms are actually culturally ingrained principle of correct and incorrect behavior, but norms also have their own nature. That is, they are cloudy, they are gray, they are ambiguous. And I think Pak Aria came with a very interesting topic that Islamic law as rules that help clarify this gray, cloudy, ambiguous area. Yeah, it is highly interesting. And before we stop this wonderful moment, I would like to ask you, Pan Aria, together with the participant, to have screenshot for a while. Is it okay?
Yeah, sure.
Pak Arif, Pak Hamka, please show yourself. Okay. Pak Jayadi, can you? Okay. Bu Dewi, Pak Arif, can I see you? Pak Hamka. Okay. Okay. Please smile. I will count until 1, 2, 3. Okay. 1, 2, 3. Okay. Thank you very much. Smile is to some extent an immunity, yeah, in the midst of this pandemic COVID-19. So, ladies and gentlemen, yeah, finally we come to the end of presentation. We would like to say thanks and thanks and thanks again to Professor Dr. Nakissa for his informative and interesting talk.
It was an honor.
To you, thank you, and to you audience for your active participations. Yeah, hopefully the presentation of Dr. Nakissa will be beneficial for everybody. Yeah, and for me as well, especially. And the under review paper of Pak Nakissa will be accepted and published soon. So
I hope so, inshallah.
Yeah, I hope so. So we have 210 participants, 217 participants will later read your paper. So I would like to inform you also that there will be a parallel discussion session today at 1 p.m. to 4 p.m. this afternoon, and tomorrow morning from 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. So thank you very much for your attention. Good morning. Yeah. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera untuk kita semua. Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya. Salam kebajikan. Sampai jumpa lagi Pak Aria. Ya. Hopefully Pak
Sampai
Aria.
jumpa. Ya, saya bersyukur kepada kalian atas kesempatan menawarkan sedikit riset saya.